Okay, thanks, Tina. Good morning, everyone. I'm Vic Harkness. I'm Senior Director at the Social Agency and also one of the new trustees of the SRA. I'm delighted to be chairing the first of our morning sessions today and to be introducing our esteemed first speaker, Danny Sriskandarajah. So Danny is Chief Exec of the New Economics Foundation. His previous roles included CEO of Oxfam GB, Secretary General of Civicus, Director of the Royal Commonwealth Society, Interim Director of the Commonwealth Foundation, and various posts at IPPR. Danny's a trustee of the Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation and a member of the Quadrature Climate Foundation's Advisory Board, and he's also a member of the UN's High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. Am I making you blush yet?
No.
Danny's opinion pieces have been published in newspapers in more than 30 countries, and he regularly appears on broadcast media. So we're delighted to have him here today to talk about the key themes from his book, Power to the People, Use Your Voice, Change the World. In this book, Danny draws on his extensive experience leading global civil society organisations to offer an optimistic, I think, antidote to voter apathy and the crisis in democracy we see today, and including the important role we as social researchers can be playing. Just before I hand over to Danny, a little bit of housekeeping just to follow up from Tina. So Danny won't be using any slides today, but a recording of the talk will be made available afterwards. We're hoping for some great questions from the audience, so I'd encourage you to add any burning questions to the Wova app, which I'll be monitoring through Danny's talk, and we'll also have a roving mic for people to ask their questions directly. So Danny, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Vic. You might be delighted that I'm here. I'm a little bit scared because in some ways I'm a failed social researcher. I really struggled through my PhD. It was hard going. I struggled through all those sort of research methods classes that I had to sit through. And in some ways, for the last 30 years, have made my way outside the academy. I sort of am a refugee from academic research because I was fascinated and remain fascinated by knowledge and evidence and the truth. But I've spent the last 30 years trying to apply it in real-world contexts, particularly in charities or non-governmental organizations. So it's a little bit scary to come and talk to a bunch of professionals who are at the cutting edge of doing social research. But you're social researchers, and so you won't mind if I begin with a bit of my own research. I've got 3 questions to ask you. I want to ask you, and if you could put your hand up, please, if you can. First question is, do you do what you do because you want to change the world? Yes? Thank you. And no? Okay, all right. So we've got, I think, I said I'm very precise about my methods. I think that's about a 98.2% yes rate. Is it getting easier to do social research? Yes, if it is. A couple of hesitant hands, I suspect. Is it getting? It's getting harder. Right. Okay. So just over half, I'd say, saying it's getting harder. And is it getting easier to influence policy change in your experience? So using your research, what you do to change the world, is it getting easier to influence policy change? Yes, if you agree? Okay, a very small number of people. And no, if you disagree. It's getting harder to influence policy change. Okay, so maybe a third saying it's harder, a very small number saying easier. I was curious about those 3 questions because the 3 things I want to sort of provoke at the start of today are simply these. I do think as social researchers or people interested in social research, we need to get better at generating, using and securing the evidence base that we work with. I'll explain all this in a bit. So getting better at evidence wrangling, if you will. Secondly, I do think we need to rethink the assumptions we have about the sort of the chain, the logical flow between evidence and change, particularly what we call evidence-based policymaking, because I think it's getting more chaotic and in many ways more difficult to use research and knowledge to influence change. But I am hopeful and optimistic because I think therein lies, in all of that chaos and uncertainty and digital disruption, a really valuable role for people like you to play in the sort of in these new knowledge economies, let's say. And the third and perhaps most important point I want to make is I think social researchers hold the key to something fundamental around democratization. That we live in a period of human history where people are feeling angry, unheard, left out, uncertain and anxious. And social research done well in a truly inclusive and participatory manner has the potential to reimagine and buttress democracy and democratic practice. So 3 points really. Let's get better at evidence really quickly. Let's rethink how that chain works from generating evidence to changing policy. And thirdly, can we, in the practice of social research, help democracy evolve and thrive? The first point is relatively straightforward, I think, which is, in my view, there's a gap we need to close really quickly between sort of public-oriented research and the evidence on which that's based, and what's happening in the real world when it comes to data and evidence. It strikes me that this device knows far more, unimaginably more, about me, my habits, my preferences, my movements, my desires, my fears, than probably all of the data sets that we are working with. In some ways, that's wonderful, right? How remarkable that humans have become so ingenious that we can collect and aggregate and interplay data at lightning speed, in such volumes, so quickly. I mean, it is. If you'd asked me 25 years ago, would we be able to know what we know? I would have said, no, don't be silly. We wouldn't be able to do all of this on a little device and be able to generate and know so much. But yet, when I look at the sort of the practice of social research in say, universities or the public sector generally, it feels like we're so far behind what the sort of data and tech giants know and can know. And so in some ways, I think we need to close that gap. How do we get public-oriented data to benefit from the digital tools and technology, AI and other opportunities? But importantly, how do we also protect the public interest in that process and make sure that that data that Meta or Alphabet has on me is not abused by the so-called sort of techno-feudalists to exploit and extract value from us, but B, harnessed in a way that can then be used for public-oriented research or knowledge. And it really worries me that a lot of public policy making is struggling with just the first bits of those. We're trying to think through still what guardrails we might put retrospectively on what's happening in terms of the digital world, not even yet thinking about how do we harness that data that's now held in private hands for public good. But it's also maybe a bit more straightforward. I work in a think tank, and I was telling a colleague yesterday that I was coming here, and I said, look, what advice would you have? And he says, well, he works on the welfare system, and he says, even something as basic as connecting survey data with administrative data that the government or government agencies hold, he says, would be a huge help. We're behind other European countries in terms of the safe access to linked data, and it's making his life, our life, much more difficult. So I think there's a lot we can do to innovate and protect the evidence base that we work on. Secondly, when I started, my first job out of university was in a think tank, and that was 25 years ago. And in those days, in simpler days, it felt like a straightforward, almost linear process in which, if you worked in a think tank or in a social research agency or a university with a policy-oriented project, our job was to come up with the knowledge, the truth, the evidence, communicate it in reasonable and accessible ways so that those people who are going to make decisions would, understand and know about what we have to do, and that through that sort of process, they will then make better decisions, evidence-based policymaking, and that sort of linear chain. And in 25 short years, almost all of those sort of assumptions that we made about how policy change happens seem to be uncertain, right? So the very notion of experts and expertise feels under threat in society today. Why do you claim to know the truth? Why does your evidence matter more? Communicating in the old days was relatively simple. You published a report, or maybe you wrote an op-ed or a short article to communicate your research findings to the world. And in a relatively narrow set of, or narrow media environment, finding ways to communicate to the people you wanted to reach was relatively straightforward. That feels like it's been blown up as well, because we live in a sort of much more diverse, chaotic media and social media environment, and so just working out how do you get the knowledge that you've worked to produce to the right people at the right time and in a trusted way feels more difficult. And finally, the sort of assumption that policymakers themselves will see good evidence and make better decisions as a result of that, I also am now worried about. I mean, these days I'm in the sort of think tank world and often coming across the sort of the coalface of politics and decision making, and I worry that we now have a generation of politicians who actually don't care about evidence. I heard a really worrying story about a very senior Secretary of State literally saying to a head of research, I don't care what the evidence says, I need to do what's politically expedient. And maybe that's always been the case. Politicians do what politicians do, but it feels more common for that to happen. And I fear that we're living in a world, in a political environment, where that's going to happen more and more, where, if you put all of that together, that experts and expertise are questioned or distrusted, that the channels by which you can establish authority, credibility, legitimacy are more difficult, and then your ultimate audience actually is being motivated by all sorts of other pressures, ideology, political incentives, then we live in a more chaotic environment. But here's the good news, because Tina said I had to be hopeful and optimistic. And I think the good news is, someone when I started 25 years ago said, Danny, you've got to remember, actually policy change doesn't happen through publishing a report or even writing an op-ed in The Guardian. It happens over a coffee or a beer. And that was actually really good advice, because certainly in the last 25 years, that seems how any impact I've been able to achieve has been through relationships that I've had. And those coffees or those beers in which you build trust and a rapport with people who you're trying to influence, understand their fears and anxieties, address them, and it's slow, it's unpredictable, it might be futile, but investing in those relationships ultimately is the key to being able to deliver the sort of change you want. And that I say that's a hopeful point, because I think it sort of forces us, particularly when it's easier and easier to do the data wrangling, and AI makes it easier to do the analysis and the sort of processing of information, the human in the piece, us, becomes more important for the relationships we're able to build and hold. And so I think amidst all of this chaos and unpredictability, I think the future of impact-led social research is, you know, we'll still need good quality, robust evidence. I'm not saying we don't, but that's not going to be sufficient to deliver the change we want, because if you are interested in changing the world, and 98.2% of you do, then we need to get better at building those relationships and working with people. So talking about working with people, this is my final point, which is that I think gone are the days when researchers can simply be there as neutral arbiters who collect, sometimes extract information and data from people or societies and use it for public good. There was always something worrying and patronizing and paternalistic about or the risk of that being an extractive process. I think we're at a moment where we really have to ask ourselves and challenge ourselves about our practice and whether we really are being as inclusive, as participatory, and as empowering as we need to be. And it's always been the case in social, you know, I grew up largely in the development studies community, thinking about how do you do research in so-called developing countries in the global south. And you know, 50 years ago, people like Robert Chambers were talking about participatory action research, or others were talking about just action research more generally, and saying even the very practice of research has to be intentional about inclusion and participation, that researchers have to be reflexive about the power that we hold and engage the people that we work with in an honest and inclusive way. That, you know, it was always in the back of my mind that there are people, you know, who are onto something there, because certainly in the development world, that's been my experience, that the moment someone, particularly from outside that society, steps in and says, you know, I'm going to try to understand your problems and help you solve it, we're lost, right? Because from the get-go, you've already got an unhealthy dynamic. And whereas the far more effective approaches are much more bottom-up and inclusive, and also much more effective. You know, when I worked at Oxfam, the projects that by far were more effective were the ones that started with a participatory approach. So rather than go to a country and say, we know best, we've got the solutions, we've got the kit or the technology that's going to save you, you start with community first and you say, what are your needs? What are your resources? What are the incentive structures around you and your communities? And how do you leverage change? And in that process, might we be able to help with some resources or technology or kit or whatever else it is? And those sorts of practices were far more effective, disruptive for the sort of development industrial complex, if you will, for the sort of structures in the system, but much more effective. But even more, you know, today at the New Economics Foundation, what we're finding is the most interesting and exciting bits of work that we're doing as a traditional think tank are far more inclusive and participatory. Let me give you a couple of examples. We are working at the moment on rent control. So those of you who are in the private rental market will know that rents have been rising exponentially. We and many others have been writing report after report saying we need to do something about the sort of rent crisis. And we've done research, we've done polls, we've done focus groups with renters. And the message has not seemed to get through to policymakers, even so-called progressive ones, to say, look, you need to intervene here and do something. That's starting to change, and in our experience, one of the reasons that's starting to change is, before I started at NEF, we took a different approach. We said, we'll do some research but we'll do it as part of a broader social movement. And so we joined and now run the secretariat for a broader alliance called the Homes for Us Alliance. Have a look, it's all in the public domain. And I think it's now about 60 or so different organizations, campaigns, renters unions, and activist groups who work together to think about housing affordability, particularly in the private rented market. And what's fascinating about this process is it's disconcerting as researchers because my colleagues who are in that project can no longer go there to say, hey, we're here to find out about what's going to help you. It's more like we're there to listen, accompany, and empower through the knowledge bits of that process, a broader movement. It holds us to account in a far more powerful way. But what's been fun and fulfilling about the process is that all of a sudden politicians are listening to us a little bit more, right? And so partly it's because we did a large demonstration through London a few months ago, or we were part of a large demonstration demanding action on rent and housing justice. Partly because when we go to the housing minister and we say, look, it's not us who want to meet you to lobby for a change, it's these people who represent thousands or tens of thousands of residents or voters who want to meet with you. And so that approach of thinking about research in action, in practice, has been sort of in some ways disruptive but liberating. Or another example is right now in Manchester, in Greater Manchester, we're in the middle of setting up a pilot to do with living income. And so living income is this notion that it's not quite UBI, Universal Basic Income. The idea is that everyone in a society should be provided with a living income, not just through the income that they receive, but through the support they might get through public services. And so you get a minimum income standard, if you will, through support. And what that will need is an uplift in payments people receive, particularly if you're on benefits, but it will require changes to the way that the welfare system works. And so we've been working with a guy called Andy Burnham, who you may have heard of, while he was Greater Manchester Mayor, to set up a pilot to involve a few hundred households, people in receipt of universal credit or benefits, to run a 2-year process of where we take these households, put them through we give them an uplift in the benefits they receive. We work with local authorities to make their support much less conditional. So it's almost 2 years of unconditional support, and then do some work to understand the impacts. So, thank you. And the lesson I want to close on this is what's been fascinating is the temptation for the researchers, including in my own team, but all the researchers we encounter is, oh, is this a randomized, is it an RCT? I said, no. This is a political demonstration that's informed by good quality research practice, but actually what we're here to do is engage politicians and the political process in demonstrating that this actually is an interesting thing. And how do we do that? We do that again by working with social movements and others. So we are just one of several organizations and campaign groups that are working on this project, if you will. And so it's not a traditional research project where research or research institution goes in and does something like that. It's empowering in itself. And we went, certainly when Andy was in the mayoralty, it was also sponsored, if you will, by a politician in a political system that wants to do something of an experiment. So that, to me, is a far more interesting model of research and practice. And I want to close by saying, no longer is the idea of participation something sort of ornamental, if you will, that's a nice to have in your research, because if you worry, as I do, that we're living through this sort of democratic crisis where people are feeling unheard and powerless, then the more that we can do applied social research that includes them in a meaningful way, that they feel like they're co-creating the solutions that are being generated, the more that we can help save democracy, if you will. So 3 messages. Let's get serious about closing that gap on evidence. Let's rethink our role in the sort of change-making cycle, and let's really get serious about democratizing research itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danny. Some really good challenges there for us. And I'm pleased to say some related questions, I think, about those challenges in the WOVRAP. So thanks, everybody, for submitting your questions. So one here around sort of the influencing and the relationships. And I think there's quite a few of us, and we saw from the sort of votes, that it's getting harder to influence policy with evidence. Did it really used to be easier? And do you have an example of sort of how we could potentially sort of try and overcome those challenges? And I think particularly in the context of so much being done digitally now, and the sort of the online and the Teams and the less face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, I do think it was easier. If I think back to early in my career and doing a similar job, trying to work in an independent think tank to influence policy, particularly at the UK government level, it was easier for a few reasons. One is there were, I think politicians had more interest in ideas and experiments. They had more resources. There were fewer people to engage, fewer media channels to read, if you will. There's, the media marketplace was less diverse. So, literally, I remember in my career early on writing an op-ed in The Guardian. Well, no, let me give you a better example. I wrote a piece in Prospect magazine in 2006 calling for something. I used to work on migration policy, saying, wouldn't it be good if the UK did X? Liam Byrne, who was then minister, apparently had read that piece in Prospect and got his team to call us up and made the proposal happen. Right? So what's the lesson? Well, the good news is, one of the things that's sort of better is in those days, there were fewer channels to communicate through. People bought magazines called like Prospect and read them. And in some ways, the elites, and I was one of those, who had access to be able to write pieces in Prospect, had a better chance of being heard and listened to. So in some ways, we've democratized the platforms. But the politicians I encounter these days, frankly, less interested in ideas, feel like they've got less resources, and they're running on fear. There's a sort of paranoia that they just can't afford to get it wrong. And I feel for them because, politics is brutal at the moment, and, democracy is in trouble, and there is a rise of far-right populism, and so they don't want to get it wrong. But that means that they're less willing to then think about, truly disruptive, interesting, radical ideas in some ways. Just at a moment, I believe, when we need those radical ideas, or at least to test some different ways of doing things.
Do you feel anything changing with the direction of the potential new Prime Minister and government? I think particularly thinking about the sort of move to more kind of devolution.
Yes. Absolutely, I think there's everything that we've seen and heard from Andy Burnham, and assuming he's going to be the Prime Minister, is good in that regard. I think, one, he's serious about devolution, and we live in one of the most centralised countries in the world, and so doing that more meaningfully is important. He's also serious about doing, like the living income example, which he's very passionate about. He's serious about trying to do things differently in the way that the state works. And then the final thing is that he, don't forget, is very interested in political reform, democratization, changing the first past the post system. I gave him a copy of my book a few months ago, and he seems to have read it because he messaged me back and said, look, I have this proposal to replace the House of Lords with the House of the People. Why do we have what we call ourselves a democracy, but we have an unelected upper house with something like 850 people in it, 7% of whom are former party donors or officials? That's not democratic, so I think we should replace it with a house of the people, citizens selected by sortition who'd act like an upper house of review when there are big, thorny ethical challenges facing society. Anyway, he loves that sort of idea. I don't know whether he'll do it. I hope he does. So I'm optimistic that both on the substance, but also maybe the process of politics, there's an opportunity here. But politicians these days are under huge constraints, and the closer they get to power, the more fear sets in.
Yeah, yeah. Great, thanks, Danny. So we've got a question here that's had quite a few votes. So, Danny, if relationships become the primary mechanism for influencing decision makers who are resistant, some of whom are resistant to evidence or fairness, do we risk compromising the core principles of social research? Where, how do we draw the line between building influence through relationships and protecting truth, accountability, and independent evidence?
Yeah, that's a super question. And we have to deal with that every day, working in a sort of think tank context, particularly because we're an independent registered charity and we can't compromise our own principles of neutrality and independence. Look, the way we approach it is it's really important to have quality assurance on the evidence base. So we try to make sure that everything we do is independently assessed, and we can be confident about the robustness of what we're saying. We might make occasional mistakes, but we're confident about the process that we've got in place. So we're not trying to fudge the numbers or make stuff up. That's really important, and trying to prevent that from happening. But I think there's a sort of translation piece, and part of it is it's not necessarily expecting one person to do every bit of the job. It might be that there are some people in our research team who are data wrangling or doing the research, but we also have an advocacy team and a communications team who are then translating that and then building some of those relationships. And so we're lucky in some ways. We're 50 people, so we're of a size where you can have specialisms within the organization. But the whole system is devoted to this idea of impact and change, not just producing knowledge. I mean, I used to joke that when I left the academy, one of the reasons was people often did work because they were motivated because they found an interesting question, not an important social problem that needed to be changed. And we start every day thinking, what are the problems we see in society and how do we change them? How do we build the evidence base that we can, build that argument, but also how do we build the relationships with the right people so that we can have the best chance of delivering change?
Well, thank you. I'm going to take one more question through the app, and then I am conscious of time, but we did start a little bit late. So if it's okay, just in case anyone hasn't been able to access or put their question on the app, can potentially take a couple of questions from the audience as well, wherever the roving mics are. So this question is: you spoke about the Manchester pilot. Any tips on how to balance the need for immediate insights versus ensuring research is set up in the best way and trialling approaches before running with them?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So the sort of immediate insight bit can also be, let me use that example. So one of our initial breakthroughs on that Greater Manchester Living Income project was at a very early meeting in that process, we had very senior officials from the Greater Manchester Authority come and meet some of the people who were setting up the project. We didn't call it a focus group, but it effectively became one. It became a focus group because the officials, very senior officials, were sitting with people who were experiencing poverty, a cooperative that was trying to work with people who are in poverty, and thinking through what might the solutions be. And so in some ways we didn't ever intended it to be like this, but there was sort of early evidence and in some ways early impact from the get-go because we got those people in. Now, maybe in a traditional sense you can say, well, you've already compromised the quality of the process because you know, whatever. But I think that's what my point is. We were trying to design for impact from the get-go, and so change the methodology or the method in that example.
Not getting obsessed with the purity point too much. Yeah, great. Thank you. Any sort of doing? Yes, gentleman with the white shirt. I think we've probably just got time for one, so we'll take this one and then close up.
Thank you very much, Danny. That was fascinating. What I was really interested in is the potential parallels between the second and third part. So you talked about the importance of building relationships with policymakers in order to influence change. And then the third part, you talked about the importance of participatory research, of empowering people, of not coming in as if you're the expert. And it struck me that a lot of that would also apply to a researcher's role in relation to policymakers. I think your response on the the living wage in Manchester speaks to that. So I'd just be interested in your views on that.
Sorry, views on the relationship between...
So it just struck me that a lot of what you said about how we as researchers should be working with people, communities and so on in terms of trying to empower people, co-create knowledge, not coming in as if we're the experts and we know everything, applied equally to how we should relate to policymakers in terms of helping them think through policy challenges.
You're right, well spotted. I suppose it's... in some ways, it's about maybe it's a common humility in both sets of those relationships, right? And I haven't encountered that many folk in my life who think they know it all. Occasionally I do it. Most of us recognize we don't know it all, but somehow end up sort of projecting this notion. Maybe it's a self-defense thing. You know, I'm the expert. I know this stuff. I've been doing this for years, decades. And when you're facing communities or the people you're working with or accompanying, you need to be humble and say, actually, I'm here to learn together. Or let's learn together about this thing and let's change the world together. And yeah, with the policymakers as well, you know, sometimes maybe, again, it's a matter of self-defense. We want to project that we're the expert in the room. But actually letting down our defenses there too can be more effective, because over that coffee or that beer with the policymaker, you might be able to say, yeah, what your starting point might not be, let me tell you what I know. Your first question might be, what's on your mind? What are the big challenges? What are the blockers that are at play in stopping you from doing the things that my colleagues and I have been asking you to do for a while? Might get you along a much more fruitful path that way. And so I think that's really important. The other way about, you know, a lot of my colleagues adopt a community organizing approach. So Marshall Gantz is the American who's often has a methodology around community organizing. And as researchers, it's actually really, really humbling because that methodology forces you to almost sort of drop your research questions. So you can't go into a community organizing practice and say, I want to know about this. You have to go in and say, you know, your purpose has to be about building power, building relational power of the people that you're working alongside. And that might take you in all sorts of other directions, because the sort of project that you got funded to do might not be of interest to the community that you're working with. And if you're pure to that methodology, you've got to go with the community and you've got to explain to your donors or your, you know, whoever else, actually, you funded us to do some work on, I don't know, climate, but housing is the number one concern of this community, and we're going to work on that, and we're going to provide some knowledge and other tools alongside that journey. But I come back to this idea that, you know, a lot of those old assumptions were built on, I think, some very fragile assumptions about how society works. You know, that there were experts, there are these institutions that you can trust, that democracy is stable. Some of that feels very fragile. And if all we do is go back to what we know and say, oh, I just need to get better at my research methodology or better at harnessing those old tools, I think we're lost, and we don't make the most of this opportunity, which is to try to design sort of new ways of doing, of being, which comes back to my ultimate point, which is if you believe, as I do, knowledge, evidence, and the truth is central to what we as humans do with each other. Society is built on knowledge, evidence, and truth, and so how we harness, use, wrangle that is fundamentally important for the future of our society. And just as things feel really fragile, there's also an opportunity for us through our practice to sort of build the new, if you will. And I think that's the sort of opportunity that we have before us.
There we go. Well, on that note, Danny, thank you so much for setting us up so well for the rest of the day. Really fascinating talk. There have been quite a few questions coming through on the Wova app. Just to say, I did check with Danny, and he is on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, so if you want to contact him with any burning questions we haven't been able to answer, he will be happy to do so. So thank you so much, Danny, and I'm going to hand over to Lydia, who's going to introduce the next session, but round of applause.